at 5 in the morning, while Moscow is still dark, and the breath of strangers hangs in pale clouds above the pavement. A woman tightens her scarf and stares at a shop window that has nothing in it. She isn't early because she enjoys the cold. She is early because the rumor is specific. Today, at this address, there might be sausages, and in the Soviet Union, a rumor could be more valuable than money. To outsiders, the Soviet queue is often remembered as a punchline: grey people, grey coats, grey buildings, and endless lines for grey goods. But the line was not a joke to the people inside it. It was a daily battlefield where time, health, and dignity was spent like currency. It could be monotonous, yes, hours of shuffling forward by inches, but it could also be violent, politically explosive, and, at key moments, lethal. If you want to understand how a superpower could have nuclear submarines and yet fail to provide soap, you have to start here, on the cracked sidewalk in the wind, among people who learned to stand still for survival. The brutality of Soviet queues wasn't only in the waiting. It was in what the waiting did to the human nervous system, to families, to workplaces, and to faith in the future. The queue was where the grand promises of the planned economy met the hard edge of reality: limited supply, fixed prices, and a population trained to treat scarcity as normal. It was a place where a pensioner could be knocked down for a chicken, where a factory foreman might secretly release workers early because half his shift needed to stand in line for butter, and where a single government announcement an increase in meat prices could ignite a protest that ended in gunfire. And because queues were so common, they were also a kind of silent mass referendum. People didn't vote against the system in elections. They voted with their feet, day after day, outside grocery stores and state shops. How brutal were the Soviet queues? Brutal enough that they shaped politics. Brutal enough that they shaped language. Brutal enough that they helped bring an entire state to the edge, and then over it. You can hear the Soviet queue before you see it. The murmur of calculation: who is last, who is holding a place for someone else, whether the delivery truck has arrived. The scrape of boots on icy concrete. The occasional flare of anger that snaps through the line like an electric arc. In Russian, tu posledny, who's last, isn't merely a question. In the late Soviet decades, it was practically a ritual greeting, a password spoken to enter the temporary society of the line. You asked, you located the last person, and you became part of something that could last an hour or an entire day. Sometimes the line did not even know what it was for yet. People queued first and figured out the commodity later, because the true resource was not sausage or sugar, but opportunity. That habit stand, now, learn later, did not appear out of nowhere. It was built into the Soviet 20th century like rebar inside concrete. In the 1930s, the Soviet Union was undergoing forced industrialization and collectivization, a transformation driven with ruthless speed by Joseph Stalin and his state. Collectivization shattered traditional agriculture, and the resulting chaos contributed to catastrophic famine in 1932-1933, including in Ukraine and other grain-producing regions. The countryside bled, cities were prioritized, urban rationing systems, state distribution, and strict controls became the framework of survival. In those years, queues and shortages were not simply inconveniences. They were tied to life and death. Even when the state managed to stock certain urban centers better than rural areas, the price was constant anxiety, because when supply is uncertain and the state is the distributor, you learn quickly that nothing is guaranteed. In the early Stalin era, the Soviet state experimented with multiple distribution channels. There were ordinary state stores with controlled prices, but there were also special systems that contradicted the official ideology of equality. One of the most striking was Torchin, a chain of stores in the early 1930s that sold goods, food, clothing, household items for hard currency, gold, and valuables. Families sold heirlooms and wedding rings to buy flour or sugar. The existence of Torchin revealed a brutal truth. Even in a state that condemned capitalism, access could be purchased if you had the right form of wealth. It also taught an early lesson that would echo for decades: the queue is for those without privilege. But if the 1930s established scarcity as a feature of Soviet life, the Second World War turned it into something far darker. In June 1941, Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union. By September 1941, Leningrad, today's St. Petersburg, was encircled. The siege of Leningrad lasted until January 1944, and its death toll is estimated in the hundreds of thousands, often cited around 1 million civilians dead from starvation, cold, and bombardment. In the siege, the queue became an instrument of endurance at the edge of human capacity. People stood in lines for bread rations while artillery thumped in the distance and the city's infrastructure collapsed. In November 1941, bread rations fell to some of the lowest levels of the siege: 250 grams per day for workers and 125 grams per dependents, and many others. Those numbers are not abstract. Picture what 125 grams looks like in the palm of a hand. Thin, dark bread often bulks with substitutes. Now picture the physical state of the person holding it: underfed, weak, dizzy, walking on streets where bodies sometimes lay under snow because there was no strength left to move them. The bread line could be a place where people fainted and did not stand back up. The cruelty was not that someone was forced to wait for a consumer good. It was that the line itself was part of the daily arithmetic of death. If you were too weak to stand, you might not eat. This is where the Soviet queue shows its first terrifying face. It was not only a symptom of shortage, it was a sorting mechanism. It sorted those who could still physically endure from those who could not. It sorted people with connections: someone who knew a bakery worker, someone who could barter an object away from those who had nothing but their ration card. And that sorting did not vanish when the war ended. After 1945, the Soviet Union emerged victorious but devastated. Entire regions were destroyed, infrastructure shattered, millions dead. Rationing continued in the post-war years and was not abolished until December 1947. The end of rationing was presented as a triumph, a signal that normal life was returning. But abolishing ration cards did not magically fill shelves. It changed the shape of scarcity rather than eliminating it. The queue remained. Now it took on the form that would become familiar in the late Soviet decades: a peculiar blend of official optimism and everyday improvisation. The state could announce record harvests and boast of steel production, while ordinary people learned to keep spare bags at home because you never knew when something would be thrown out for sale. The Soviet planned economy could be stunningly effective at mobilizing resources for specific goals: tanks, rockets, heavy industry, but clumsy and often indifferent when it came to consumer goods, variety, and reliability. Central planning struggled with the countless variables of daily consumption: not just how many shoes are needed, but what sizes, what styles, what season, what region, what quality, what replacement rate. When prices are fixed and cannot rise to signal scarcity, shortage does not express itself in higher cost. It expresses itself in empty shelves and long lines. The price becomes time, and time was extracted from people relentlessly. By the 1960s, the Soviet Union had achieved feats that were meant to prove the system's superiority. In October 1957, Sputnik became the first artificial satellite. In April 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space. The imagery was powerful: a modern state leaping into the cosmos. But the contrast between cosmic triumph and earthly shortage became a quiet, corrosive joke. What did it mean to be first in space if you still had to stand for hours to buy meat? This tension between the image of abundance promised by socialism and the lived reality of queues built pressure over years. People adapted with strategies that were almost universal. They used BLAT, informal networks of favors and connections, to bypass lines or secure scarce goods. They cultivated friendships with shop assistants, warehouse workers, managers. They traded access the way people elsewhere trade money. They learned which stores received deliveries on which days. They learned to read the street, the way sailors raid the sea. A sudden crowd outside a shop meant something had arrived or was expected. You could be walking home and see a line and join it without knowing why, because whatever it was probably worth it. That constant improvisation had a cost. It distorted work. In a society where employment was formally guaranteed, where the state promised stability, the daily search for goods undermined productivity in a quieter way than sabotage. If half your colleagues needed to leave early because there was a line for shoes, what did full employment really mean? Factories could meet planned targets in tonnage and still lose millions of hours to the informal economy of waiting. The queue became a shadow schedule running parallel to the official timetable, and sometimes the queue became an arena of open political danger. On May 31, 1962, the Soviet government announced price increases on meat and dairy products. The timing was combustible. At the same time, workers at the Novocherkassk electric locomotive plant, NEVZ in the city of Novocherkassk in the Rostov region, faced wage cuts through changes in work norms and piece rates. It was a classic pressure cooker scenario: higher prices for basic food, lower earnings, and a working class that was supposed to be the regime's foundation. The next day, June 1, 1962, a strike began at the plant. Workers gathered, angry and humiliated. The protest quickly spread beyond the factory gates. By June 2nd, thousands of people were in the streets, moving toward the city center and the local Communist Party headquarters. In Soviet political mythology, spontaneous mass protest was supposed to belong to the pre-revolutionary past, to capitalism, to class enemies. But now it was Soviet workers' people the state claimed to represent, demanding meat and fairness. What happens when the state that prides itself on order meets a crowd whose anger is fueled not by ideology but by hunger and indignity? The answer in Novocherkassk was gunfire. On June 2, 1962, troops and security forces confronted demonstrators. Shots were fired. The documented death toll is over 20 killed, often cited as 26 dead and dozens wounded, with many more arrested afterward. The Soviet state concealed the event for decades. Families were pressured into silence. Trials followed. Several people were executed. The massacre did not become public knowledge in the Soviet Union until the late 1980s, during Mikhail Gorbachev's policy of glasnost. Novocherkassk matters because it shows the queue's hidden political power. The protest was not about queues in a narrow sense. It was about the entire system of distribution and respect. But the trigger was food prices and the feeling that the state could not keep its side of the social contract. In a planned economy, legitimacy is not only built on ideology, it is built on the promise that basic needs will be met. Raise the cost of meat, squeeze wages, and you are not merely adjusting an economic parameter, you are telling people that their sacrifices are unreciprocated. You are pushing them back into the line, literally and figuratively, and demanding they endure it quietly. The brutality of Soviet queues, then, was not only in individual episodes of pushing and shouting. It was that queues were a daily reminder of who had power and who did not. The state had the power to allocate. The citizen had the obligation to wait. As the decades moved on, the Soviet Union became more stable in some ways and more stagnant in others. Under Leonid Brezhnev, who led the country from 1964 until his death in 1982, the era is often described as one of stagnation. There was social stability, predictable careers, modest improvements in housing and education for many, but the consumer sphere remained a landscape of shortages and workarounds. Scholars and journalists described a paradox. The Soviet economy produced immense quantities of certain goods, yet the everyday experience was one of absence of choice, absence of reliability, absence of quality. It was not always that there was no food. Sometimes it was that there was food, but not the food people needed that week. not in the right place, not at the right time. Distribution failures could leave one region relatively supplied and another suddenly empty. Seasonal variations, transportation bottlenecks, and planning errors could ripple into daily life. Because prices were often kept artificially low for social and political reasons, demand could exceed supply even when production was substantial. In market systems, scarcity can show up as price increases. In the Soviet system, scarcity showed up as the line itself, a physical manifestation of imbalance. The line became a stage for a peculiar kind of social life. People talked. They exchanged rumors. They policed each other. They invented rules. A queue might appoint someone to keep a list of names, especially if the wait was expected to last hours and people needed to step away. People would argue over holders, the practice of one person standing for several family members. Others would accuse newcomers of cutting. The line created a temporary community, but it was a stressed community, always vulnerable to betrayal. And betrayal had many forms. There was the small betrayal of the shop manager who saved the best goods under the counter for friends and officials, leaving the line to fight over what remained. There was the structural betrayal of a system that promised a classless society while maintaining special distribution networks for elites. In many Soviet cities, there were stores and supply systems for the party apparatus, for certain professions, for those with access. There were also hard currency stores like Berkendute, where goods could be bought with foreign currency or special checks, effectively walling off abundance behind a barrier most citizens could not cross. The queue, again, was for those without the right papers, the right job, the right connections. In the 1970s, Western observers who visited the USSR often described lines as one of the most striking features of daily life. Journalist Hedrick Smith, in his 1976 book The Russians, portrayed the queue as a central institution of Soviet society, a place where citizens spent astonishing amounts of time and developed an entire culture of coping. Soviet satirists and ordinary people joked that the line was the only place where the government truly achieved equality. Everyone waited, but even that joke contained a sting, because everyone did not wait equally. Some waited in heated offices while others stood outside in snow. The physical conditions of the queue mattered. In much of the Soviet Union, winter is not a minor inconvenience. It is a force. Wind cuts through wool. Ice forms on eyelashes. Boots become numb blocks. People stood for food in temperatures far below freezing. In summer, the line could be a different misery. Heat, sweat, the smell of a crowd packed tight, the tension of bodies pressed too close because nobody wanted to lose their place. And through all of it, there was always the fear that it would be for nothing. Because the most humiliating moment in any shortage economy is not the wait, it is the announcement, after hours, that the supply is over. The delivery is smaller than expected. The shop is closing. The last item has been sold to the person just ahead of you. Your time is gone, and you have nothing to show your children. The queue was a machine that could convert human life into emptiness. By the early 1980s, the Soviet Union was already facing deep economic problems, slowing growth, inefficient industries, a costly military posture in the Cold War, and the burden of the war in Afghanistan, which began in 1979. Yet the public narrative often remained triumphant, the familiar language of plans and achievements. There is a particular cruelty in that contrast. When official media insists that life is improving while your lived experience is standing in line for basics, the gap becomes not merely frustrating, it becomes insulting. Then, in March 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary of the Communist Party. He inherited a system that could no longer coast on inertia. His reforms, perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost, openness, were designed to revive the Soviet economy and society. But reforms in a brittle system can behave like stress fractures. They can spread in unpredictable directions. One early policy with major social effects was the anti-alcohol campaign launched in 1985. The Soviet state had long relied on alcohol sales for revenue, and heavy drinking was a major public health issue. Gorbachev's campaign restricted sales, reduced production, and increased enforcement. The intention included improving health and productivity, but a predictable consequence of restricting a widely consumed commodity in a shortage-prone system was another wave of queues. Vodka became harder to buy legally. People lined up for it. Moonshine production rose. The state lost revenue, and public frustration grew. In an economy where queues already consumed daily life, adding another line, another competition for limited supply, felt less like moral reform and more like punishment. The late 1980s were when the Soviet queue began to mutate from a chronic annoyance into an acute symptom of systemic crisis. As Gorbachev loosened controls and experimented with market-like mechanisms without fully creating a market, the old planning and distribution system lost coherence faster than a new one could replace it. Enterprises gained more autonomy in some areas. Supply chains that had depended on orders and guarantees became unstable. Republics within the USSR began asserting more control over their own resources. Hoarding grew not only by citizens, but by institutions. Goods could disappear into warehouses, into informal networks, into black markets. Price controls remained, meaning official prices often stayed low while availability collapsed, creating even greater incentive to buy anything when it appeared. And when supply becomes erratic, rumor becomes king. In those years, people queued not just for luxuries, but for essentials: sugar, soap, detergent, meat, butter. In some places, rationing returned in new forms: coupons and local distribution limits. The sight was psychologically devastating for a state that had claimed it had moved beyond the hardships of wartime. Rationing had been abolished in 1947. Now, more than 40 years later, the Soviet citizen was once again counting and rationing, not because of foreign invasion, but because of domestic breakdown. The queue also became more openly angry. In earlier decades, cynicism and resignation often dominated complaints muttered under breath, jokes traded quietly. By the end of the 1980s, the emotional register shifted. Anger rose because people could now speak more openly under glasnost, because expectations had been raised by talk of reform, and because the shortages were worsening rather than improving. When a society is told change is coming and then sees empty shelves, the disappointment is sharper than if nothing had been promised at all. This is where the brutality becomes hard to separate from the broader end of the Soviet project. The queue, once a familiar nuisance, became a daily sign that the center could not govern the basics. By 1989 and 1990, in many Soviet cities, the line was no longer an exception. It was the default condition. There were stories of people spending hours just to buy bread or milk. The sausage trains became a bitter symbol. Residents of smaller towns would travel to Moscow or other better supplied cities to buy meat products and carry them back because the capital seat of power was more likely to have goods. This was not unique to the USSR. Other Eastern Bloc countries experienced similar patterns, with residents traveling to better stocked areas. But in the Soviet case, the internal empire was so vast that the difference between center and periphery felt like a moral indictment. The state that insisted it was building equality was distributing inequality through logistics. The physical reality of those trips was exhausting. Long-distance trains with hard benches, bags stuffed with food, the smell of sausage, sweat and metal. People traveling not for vacation, not for opportunity, but to do what a functioning retail system would normally do for them. And if you couldn't travel because you were elderly, sick, caring for children, you were trapped in the local queue economy, dependent on whatever arrived, whenever it arrived. Meanwhile, the Soviet state was losing control of its narrative. In 1986, the Chernobyl disaster had already damaged trust in official truth. After April 26, 1986, when reactor number 1 rest, 4 exploded at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in the Ukrainian SSR. The initial secrecy and delayed public communication became emblematic of systemic dishonesty. That matters here, because queues are not only about supply, they are about trust. If you don't trust the state to tell the truth about radiation, why would you trust it to manage food distribution? In a society where rumor is already a survival tool, every official silence amplifies the authority of whispers. Then, in 1991, the Soviet Union approached its final, trembling months. The economy was in a spiral. The political center was contested between Gorbachev's weakening Union authority and rising Republican leaders, most notably Boris Yeltsin, in the Russian SFSR. The August 1991 coup attempt by hardliners, an effort to reverse reforms and preserve the USSR, failed after mass resistance in Moscow and the refusal of key military units to fully support the plotters. But the failed coup further shattered central power. The Union would formally dissolve in December 1991 after the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus signed the Belovezh Accords on December 8, declaring the USSR ceased to exist. In that atmosphere, queues were not just long, they were ominous. They felt like the ground shifting underfoot. Imagine the emotional logic of the line in those last years. You stand because you must, you hoard because you fear because you don't believe tomorrow will be normal, and the more you hoard, the faster the shelves empty, making tomorrow even less normal. The queue becomes a feedback loop. Fear generates lines. Lines generate emptiness. Emptiness generates more fear. This is how a society can look calm on the surface, people standing quietly in coats while actually experiencing a low-level panic. The Soviet queue was often disciplined in appearance because people had learned that open chaos could bring police or simply worsen your chance. But discipline is not the same as peace. Underneath there was the hard animal awareness that basic needs are non-negotiable. And yet the most dramatic proof that queues could become history-shaping violence had already happened decades earlier in Novocherkassk. That event, once hidden, returned in the late 1980s as a revelation. When glasnost allowed suppressed stories to surface, the state's past brutality became part of the present crisis. Novocherkassk told citizens the system not only fails to supply, it can kill when confronted. In the late Soviet period, there were also other moments of social unrest connected to economic shortages and the erosion of living standards, including strikes. In 1989, major coal miners' strikes erupted in the Kuzbass region and other coal basins. Miners demanded not only better wages and working conditions, but also improved supplies of consumer goods and food, because wages mean little if there is nothing to buy. These strikes were politically significant. They demonstrated that the working class, long framed as the regime's bedrock, was now publicly challenging it. The image of the Soviet worker shifted from heroic builder of socialism to exhausted man demanding soap, sausage, and dignity. To understand why the queue could help break a superpower, you have to see how it corroded the Soviet social contract from below. That contract was never written as a single document, but it was widely understood. The state would provide stability, employment, basic services, and a predictable life. In return, citizens would accept limited political freedom and the dominance of the Communist Party. This was not the terror contract of the 1930s, when fear was the main tool. It was the late Soviet bargain of security and routine. But security and routine require a functioning distribution system. When the routine collapses into constant lines, the bargain fails. People may tolerate censorship longer than they can tolerate hunger and humiliation, because hunger is immediate. The queue is where politics becomes physical. There is also a quieter brutality in what queues did to relationships and morality. Scarcity encourages certain virtues, resourcefulness, mutual help, the sharing of tips, but it also encourages suspicion, resentment, and opportunism. It teaches people to treat strangers as potential threats to their access. It teaches people that rules are negotiable if you have connections, and that honesty is punished by emptiness. A child who grows up watching a parent beg a shop clerk for an extra portion learns something powerful about authority. A worker who sees party officials bypass lines learns something powerful about hypocrisy. The Soviet system did not invent queues. All societies have had shortages, rationing, and lines, especially during war. But the Soviet queue became distinctive because it persisted for decades in a country that claimed it had solved the basic contradictions of capitalism. In a capitalist economy, the cruelty of scarcity often appears through price. People can't afford goods. In the Soviet planned economy, the cruelty often appeared through time and access. People couldn't obtain goods at any price in the official system unless they waited, begged, networked, or cheated. The Soviet citizen did not merely work a job, they worked a second job as a procurement specialist for their own household. That hidden labor, hours spent in lines, on trains, in backroom negotiations, was unpaid and unmeasured. It wore people down. It made free education and healthcare feel less like gifts when you still had to spend half your week chasing basic supplies. It also made the black market and informal economy feel not immoral but necessary, a parallel system that offered what the official one could not. And the state, in turn, often responded in ways that deepened the cynicism. When shelves were empty, officials sometimes blamed speculators rather than production or planning failures. Police might crack down on resellers. Propaganda might call for discipline. But discipline cannot conjure butter. It cannot replace a missing truck, a broken cold chain, a planned target that rewarded quantity over quality, or a bureaucracy that counted success in tons rather than satisfaction. The climax of this story is not a single day when all Soviet citizens stood in one line together. It is the moment when the queue stops being a tolerated feature of life and becomes a verdict on the system. Novichokhovsk was the violent early warning. The late 1980s were the spreading fire, and by 1990-1991, the queue had become a symbol of state failure, so obvious that no speech could fully mask it. When people line up for bread in the capital of a superpower, the image travels farther than any rocket launch. It is a kind of anti-propaganda generated not by enemies but by reality. After the Soviet Union dissolved in December 1991, the queue did not instantly disappear. In the early 1990s, Russia and other post-Soviet states experienced deep economic turmoil, inflation, and hardship. But the nature of scarcity shifted. As prices were liberalized in Russia in January 1992 under reforms associated with Yegor Gaidar, shelves that had been empty often filled because goods could now be sold at market prices. The cruelty moved from access to affordability. The line shrank in some places, but many people could no longer buy what was available. A different kind of brutality replaced the old one. That shift itself is a bitter lesson. For decades, people had spent their lives paying with time because money could not signal scarcity. Then, suddenly, scarcity was signaled brutally through money, and those without it faced a new exclusion. The queue, in its Soviet form, was not simply eliminated, it was transformed by a new economic order that brought its own winners and losers. Still, the memory of the Soviet queue endures with unusual power. It is remembered not only because it was inconvenient, but because it was intimate. High politics can feel distant. Queues are domestic. They touch the kitchen table, the child's breakfast, the old man's dignity, the exhausted mother's legs. They turn ideology into a physical sensation: cold fingers, aching back, the smell of damp wool, the taste of thin soup. And perhaps the most unsettling part is how quickly the queue can return in any society under stress. War, sanctions, panic buying, supply chain breakdowns, natural disasters, modern life has its own ways of producing lines. The technology is different, the packaging is different, the payment methods are different, but the human psychology is familiar. The fear that there won't be enough, the urge to secure your share, the anger at those who cut ahead. the quiet calculation of whether today's wait will be rewarded or wasted. The Soviet queue, at its most brutal, was a daily rehearsal for uncertainty. It trained people to expect less than they were promised. It taught them that survival depended on networks, not rights. It reminded them that the state could reach the stars and still fail at the shop counter. And when enough people live that contradiction long enough, the contradiction stops being a joke and becomes a question that cannot be ignored. What is a system worth if it cannot reliably provide bread, soap, meat if it cannot reliably provide bread, soap, meat if it cannot protect the time and dignity of the people who keep it alive? The Soviet Union answered that question unintentionally through millions of hours of waiting. The queue was not merely a line, it was a verdict written in footsteps on winter pavement, a slow-motion collapse measured not in speeches or treaties, but in the distance between an empty shelf and a citizen's outstretched hand.